results and greater implications of a study that I completed involving plant species distributions and primary succession in a coastal dune habitat. Successional theory has been studied extensively over the past century, and indeed it's been said that the theory of succession is as central a theme for ecology as evolution is for biology. So what is this key theory? It can be briefly described as the more or less predictable and orderly changes in the composition or structure of an ecological community. This may seem like kind of an abstract idea, but in reality, humans have had a basic understanding of succession for thousands of years. Think about the fundamental logic behind such ancient agricultural practices as crop rotation or slash-and-burn agriculture. These practices demonstrate an awareness of regeneration, nutrient recycling, and other successional processes. In the scientific setting, succession gives us a framework with which we can analyze the evolution of plant communities over time. One of the major challenges with the study of succession, however, is that these changes happen over extremely long periods of time, often far beyond the researcher's lifetime. Certain landscapes offer a solution to this problem. One of these such landscapes is the dune ecosystem. When sediments are deposited onshore by ocean currents and waves, sand can become airborne and aggregate on the nearest incline, which we can call the foredune. This is where the first successional stage, or sear, begins. Pioneer species are so named because they are the first plants to take advantage of this new territory and colonize the newly created landscape. Other species will soon join them and further stabilize the shifting sands, increasing the efficiency with which the foredune traps airborne sand in a positive feedback loop. Eventually, this mass becomes too large to support itself and will begin to be blown inland. You can see this in the background of the photo. It's called a blowout. Once the sand behind the migrating dune has been eroded down to the water table, the wet sand is far less prone to erosion, and vegetation will begin to take hold once more. Over time, this community, called the dune swale, will mature into something we can call a dune hollow with far more woody species. By substituting this physical space for time, we can use the dune system as a chronosequence, and in a sense, walk through time and plant community evolution as we walk inland. We can define the sear, which I mentioned earlier, as a community both in space and in time. I used the Malal Dunes in Humboldt County, Northern California, to analyze the vegetation evolution in a chronosequence. The Malal Dunes are the longest dune system in Northern California. They're also one of the few restored dune system habitats in the western United States. Invasive species have disproportionately impacted coastal areas in California. Most of these invasive species were introduced to stabilize the dunes by the immigrants that moved in, immobilizing their natural migration in order to protect the newly created housing and farmland that they'd built. This is an image of European beach grass. The stabilizing of these dunes effectively puts a halt on the natural succession of native plant communities that rely on the dynamic nature of these dunes for their survival. Malal Dunes are also home to two federally listed endangered plant species, the first one being the Humboldt Bay wallflower, which only occurs in the Humboldt Bay region, and the second, Lea carnosa, which extends farther down as far as Point Arena. As I mentioned before, succession has been extensively studied by both ecologists and physical geographers over the past century. I wanted to delve more deeply into the relationship between plant species and the specific successional sears. More specifically, my question was, to what extent do vascular plant communities and species align to successional sears on the Malal Dunes? Are certain species more closely bound to their microhabitat? And how are the endangered species distributed throughout the successional pattern? To answer these questions, I created 3 200-meter transects that began at the pioneer species that I mentioned earlier and extended inland. Throughout the transect, I had 1-meter square plots where I identified all the vascular plant species present and also collected their abundance data. The The first thing I observed is that the Malal dunes indeed do subscribe to this successional pattern. The foredune and the strand were characterized by pioneer species, and this extended to about 30 meters inland, where the dune mat community became more prevalent. This extended onto the backside of the foredune and into this depression, where the dune swale community became more prevalent. Eventually, as you move back in the succession, this matures into what we can call the dune hollow. This image shows the average number of species per plot along the 200-meter transect. As you can see, species richness was highest in the dune mat community. I did see the Humboldt Bay wallflower while I was out on the dunes, but it didn't appear in any of my transects. However, I did come across the beach layout multiple times. Its apparent preferred habitat was the dune mat community, although as you can see here, it did extend slightly into the dune swale. This graphic shows how some plant species align very closely to the successional series that I was talking about. Each individual color represents a specific plant species, whereas the colored guilds are there to show you how they were constrained to their successional series. Some plant species, like the western sea rocket, were only found in the foredune, whereas others, like the cream cup, were very restricted to the dune mat community. Still others, such as the hooker's willow and California twinberry, only really came into the picture in the more matured habitats in the dune swale and the dune hollow. Not all species were so successionally constrained. The yellow sand verbena was often one of the first species that we saw right next to the western sea rocket that I mentioned. But as you can see here, it more straddled that successional border, also extending into the dune mat community. Some of the most cosmopolitan species that I saw were the beach buckwheat and the dune goldenrod. This purple right here is the buckwheat, and this teal is the goldenrod. As you can see, they're very prevalent in the dune mat community. However, they extend very deep into the transect, usually along the edges of these dune hollows. So what do these patterns in plant distributions mean for the bigger picture? Sorry, I got a little ahead of myself. Let's quickly recap on my results. The Malal dunes do conform to the general dune chronosequence and plant successional patterns. I also found that some vascular plant species were very constricted, whereas others were more cosmopolitan, and that the dune mat community was the richest community that I sampled, and also was a favorite habitat for the endangered plant Lea carnosa. So now, what do these patterns in plant distributions imply for the bigger picture? Dune mat community, dunes represent a very important part of California geography. They comprise of over 40% of the coastline from the Oregon-California border down to Point Arena. Dune mat communities are often the most susceptible to encroachment by invasive plant species, such as European beachgrass, here, the Hottentot fig, and the yellow bush lupin. The dune habitat is naturally a sparsely vegetated habitat. These invasives effectively crowd out the native species, or in the case of the yellow bush lupin, so drastically change the soil chemistry that the native plants can no longer compete. The end result is essentially monoculture, with few other species remaining. In order to protect the species richness observed in the dune mat community, further efforts to restore and maintain the restored dunes must be continued. But encroachment of invasives didn't solely affect the native plant species. The effects of invasive also rippled, the effects, they've extended into the animal kingdom as well. The silver bee is a very important native pollinator in California. Some of its preferred foraging species are the beach pea, pictured here, and the hooker's willow. As you saw in my graphic earlier, these are species that are constrained to the successional series. Now, plant species that are further spread out along this succession are probably less threatened by the encroachment of invasives because they're more adaptable in the scales of both time and space. However, species that are confined to these successional sears could be drastically impacted by the encroachment of invasives and the immobilization of those dynamic dunes. Dunes that are overrun by invasive species offer very little support to the livelihood of pollinators such as the silver bee. Furthermore, the dunes are an imperative nesting habitat for the threatened western snowy plover. These birds prefer to lay their eggs in the more openly vegetated habitat provided by the native plant species to lay them. And this habitat isn't provided by the European beach grass, as you can see here. It grows very close together. Alternatively, this is actually a favorite habitat for the western snowy plover's largest predator, the gray fox. Dunes are an intrinsic part of California geography, but their longevity is threatened by the continued expansion of invasives and the consecutive disappearance of their native counterparts. Plant species central to the life cycles of important and threatened animal species, plus native endangered species themselves, rely on the dynamic migration of the dune system. The successional patterns that I found in plant species distributions further demonstrate the importance of restoring and maintaining the native vegetation in our coastal dune habitats. Thank you very much. Let's open up.